So I really appreciate all of you for being here, for the chance to talk some Greek philosophy. I feel a little silly occupying all your time after M.M. McCabe and Nick Smith, Michael Ehrler. But at any rate, I thought I'd bring some texts that we can all talk about. And the handout just has the Greek background. I'm not going to refer to it very much. So what I've been interested in recently is the canonical Greek virtue, Sophrosune. What exactly it is, how it became canonical, whether the anxiety or flippancy about translating into English or other languages has been justified, and so forth. The virtue also seems to have a distinct relationship with Socrates, which will be the subject of this talk, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. So having been thinking for a while about Sophrosune, I've come to have an idea, which is this. When the Greeks came to think through this virtue's nature and its value, they went some ways to articulating the idea of rational agency and selfhood. So Sophrosune became, in a way, the virtue of agency. Relatedly, the Greeks sometimes presented it as the fundamental virtue, either that of which other virtues are subtypes or a condition for being virtuous in those other ways. So I think that Sophrosune is the star of the party. This is not the universal view. The scholarship is small compared to that on justice or wisdom, even piety. There are two books that you probably know by North and Rademacher, both in English, but to my eyes, they're more impressed by the apparent diversity of applications than seek a substantive unity among them. Now, I would know sometimes you get some stuff about Sophrosune in an introduction to Plato's Charmides, but that's not always worth all that much. So I have a hunch why there's as yet no international study for the Society of Sophrosune. Many people have been, I think, generally convinced by Aristotle's account of the virtue, that it is moderation with respect to the necessary bodily appetites, drinking, eating, and sex, so he says. And so for all the non-gluttons, non-alcoholics, non-Casanovas out there, Sophrosune doesn't seem all that difficult or complicated, that it's so frequently translated moderation, which is the beigest of accomplishments, adds to its philosophical peripherality. Now, I'm pretty sure that Aristotle's account is not representative of classical conceptions of Sophrosune, despite his presenting it that way. True enough, he may have his reasons for redefining the virtue in accordance with his biological psychology to prefer a theoretical cleanliness. But his account of Sophrosune is not the standard against which to judge the validity or fecundity of other near contemporaneous accounts. Well, these accounts are found throughout classical literature. Antiphon, Critias, Democritus, and Protagoras contributed to debates about the virtues in ways we can partially reconstruct. Euripides and Thucydides represented such debates. The Pythagorean community of Xenophon articulated the bulk of its community norms by reference to Sophrosune. Of course, the fullest accounts are known from the Platonic dialogues, the Charmides, Republic 3 and 4, Socrates' pseudo-exchange with Callicles and the Gorgias, the culmination of the Statesman, early parts of the Philebus, and the first several books of the Laws. But, of course, there's also Xenophon. Reflections on Sophrosune pervade his work, as in the Agesilaus and Cyropedia, and pointedly in the Spartan Constitution. The most reflective passages are in the Memorabilia, where he presents Sophrosune as central to Socrates' project. I just mentioned the sophistic era debates about Sophrosune. I'm guessing that the historical Socrates contributed to them. There is circumstantial evidence to that effect. The prominence of the topic in Plato and Xenophon is naturally a major consideration. Antisthenes has distinctive things to say about Sophrosune, though none is really explicitly linked to Socrates. The Agon in Aristophanes' Revised Clouds between the two teachers of Socrates, or anyway, of his school, that Agon principally concerns Sophrosune. Old comic fragments beyond Aristophanes about Socrates present him as not motivated to satisfy bodily desires. Socrates' probable acquaintances, even intellectual collaborators, Critias and Euripides, as I've said frequently, thematize the virtue. Now, skeptics about the Socratic problem will doubt we can reconstruct much from this indirect or contaminated evidence. The proliferation of mutually confirming evidence may not resolve these doubts if it all results from a shared intermediate source, one that does not reliably record Socrates' views. But there is still a way open, I suppose. That is, if a number of authors attribute interest in Sophrosune to Socrates, but they elaborate that interest in distinct ways, then we have less worrying about mere copying. The elaboration shouldn't be too distinct, of course, because then we would have little reason to treat them as recollections or interpretations of Socrates' views. What this means, however, is that we need first to understand how our authors elaborate the views putatively to be assigned to Socrates. And I want to contribute to this preliminary step. And at the end of the talk, I might say something about the probative value of all of this, which is probably low. But here we are. So Xenophon twice attributes views of Sophrosune to Socrates, but before he does so, he puts a view of Socratic Sophrosune into his own voice. So I'll start by talking about memorabilia 1, 2, and these passages are on your handout. So in that chapter 1, 2, Xenophon is saying that Socrates was in effect charged with teaching Alcibiades and Critias ta politica, before teaching them Sophrosune, and was thus, to some degree, responsible for their being rapacious, violent, murderous, unrestrained, hubristic. Then in sections 14 through 29, Xenophon defends Socrates against this charge. He dedicates much time to the impermanence of virtue, allowing those bad guys to have had it only as long as they were with Socrates. Those arguments are interesting, but apply broadly to any virtue. 3 items in Xenophon's defense, however, apply specifically to Sophrosune. So first, Socrates taught Sophrosune by putting it into practice and through his conversations, Xenophon says. He showed himself to be kalos kagathos, and, so Xenophon says, he talked excellently about arete and the rest of human matters. Okay, that's what we've got. This might seem too general if the point about Sophrosune and not about Dikaiosune or Andrea, if the point is not about Dikaiosune or Andrea or virtue in general. But maybe it is correctly tailored. What if being Sophron really just is being kalokagathos, fitting oneself to the social norms of nobility and self-determination? And what if being Sophron really just involves talking about virtue and other human consideration generally? Presumably to understand what precisely virtue requires, how it guides life, and how to embody it. At this point, with too little evidence, these must remain questions, and questions the meaning of which we cannot yet fully grasp, but later I think we'll find it possible to answer them more informatively in the affirmative. A second thing Xenophon says about Sophrosune in these early pages comes once he has argued that Sophrosune is losable. This is in sections 23 and 24. He caps that thought by imagining some hedonai, pleasures, lodged in the body and soul, urging the soul to abandon Sophrosune and instead gratify both them and the body. Then, returning to the case at hand, Xenophon says that Critias and Alcibiades, when with Socrates, could rule over their non-fine the mekalon epithumiae, desires. So this picture of Sophrosune may appear more familiar. It involves the soul's kratein taking charge over certain pleasures and desires. But we note that these pleasures and desires are not exclusive to the body, even if the body is picked out as something especially to be gratified. The second sentence specifies only the mekalon desires. And this means that Sophrosune amounts to governing one's desires and authorizing as legitimate motivators of one's action only the fine ones, the fine desires. One might think then that Sophrosune involves a kind of judgment about value and then the capacity to confer legitimate efficacy only to the valuable desires. So the third passage worth looking at in this context is at the beginning of the long passage I've mentioned, when Xenophon first introduces Critias's and Alcibiades' interest in Socrates. This is in 1415. They, these associates, saw that Socrates, quote, living on the least amount of stuff, was the most self-sufficient, had the most inner control over all his pleasures, and in conversations could make whatever use he wished of his interlocutor. But Critias and Alcibiades did not want to imitate Socrates wholly. Having already been superlatively ambitious, they just wanted from Socrates what they perceived as his complete competence in speech and action. They did not desire his bios and Sophrosune. And yet, Xenophon implies that his bios of Sophrosune was not separable from his competence in speech and action. I mean, why would it be? This soon becomes clear when Critias and Alcibiades are shown inadequately competent in their lives, but we already saw it presaged here. Socrates' self-sufficiency, his ability to act unimpeded by external obstacles, depended on and was perhaps even a goal of his austere living. His self-control, his ability to act unimpeded by inner obstacles, let's say, depended on his not giving free rein to his desires. How things were with speech is less clear, though one might guess, thinking about the passage in section 18 that we talked about first, that his competence in speech came from his having talked much about virtue and human affairs, or contrastingly, because he was Encratic and thus was never distracted from the argument or overwhelmed by irrelevant considerations, conceits of honor or cleverness or unbeatability, the kinds of things we see in Plato's dialogues messing up his interlocutors. It is fair at any rate to assume that Socrates' Sophrosune was both his minimal and controlled desires and the consequent superlative degrees of agency with respect both to words and to deeds that such desire management allows and involves. So in Xenophon's voice in Memorabilia 1-2, we learn three important things about Sophrosune. Having it amounts to being kalokagathos and talking well about virtue. Amounts to the capacity to disregard the persuasions of one's pleasures and the ability to manage one's not fine desires, and to a total competence in action and speech unimpeded by external, internal, and conversational obstacles. I'd say total competence anyway contributes to total competence, because as we see later in book 4, maybe you actually need to learn some actual skills. Okay, so now let's turn to the first of Socrates' quasi-verbatim statements about Sophrosune, and this is in Memorabilia 3.9, specifically in 3.9.4. 3.9 itself, in general, reports Socrates as evidently idiosyncratic or at least distinctive or articulated views about several fundamental ethical concepts: teachability of virtue, 1 through 3, identifiability of justice and the other virtues with Sophia, 5 and 6, the failure of self-knowledge as a case of mania, which is the opposite of Sophia, 6 and 7, and so forth. In section 4, our focus, Xenophon says that Socrates, apparently in response to a question about it, did not distinguish between Sophia and Sophrosune. Socrates judged, as Xenophon puts it, that the one recognizing what is kalatekagatha, and so who does them, and knowing what is disgraceful to Iskra, and so who guards against presumably doing them, ula bestai, is the Sophos and Sophron one. Xenophon paraphrases this answer. Now, he goes on to quote Socrates on a related question, presumably a follow-up question. Socrates was asked whether he thought that those who know what they must do, but do the opposite, are Sophos and Encrates. There's some manuscript issues I won't talk about. Not so much that as Sophos and Acrates, for I think that everyone, I'm quoting Socrates via Xenophon, choosing from among what's valuable, what they consider most beneficial for them, does that. Thus, I think that those people acting incorrectly are neither Sophos nor Sophron. Socrates' answers hardly provide an argument for the identity of Sophia and Sophrosune, as though their definitions are the same. It isn't even an argument for their codependence, I don't think. It is rather an observation about their coincidence. Still, it is pretty informative about Sophrosune. In Socrates' first answer, the paraphrased one, Sophia, I think, is responsible for the recognition of ta kala te kagatha and the knowledge of ta iskra. Sophrosune would then be the doing of what is kala and the not doing of what is iskra. So it would be the capacity to follow one's judgments of value and to treat some of them, pertaining to what's kala and iskra, as authoritative, not merely theoretically interesting. In Socrates' second answer, the quoted one, we get the same view, effectively. Sophia judges which among the available options is best. That option chosen, Sophrosune allows one to act on it. That an additional virtue, Sophrosune, is necessary for good action suggests that Socrates thinks that various of the available options make claims on one as suitable grounds for action, and that some capacity is necessary for ignoring all those options except for the ones deemed best by Sophia. Socrates' second answer is to a question, obviously prompted by his first answer. If Sophia and Sophrosune always coincide in a person, how are we to understand someone who apparently knows what's right but seems not to act in accordance with it? Can we possibly hold that this person is both Sophos and Encrates? Here the questioner of Socrates is assuming basically the equivalence of Encrate and Sophrosune. While this equivalence is boldly rejected in Book 4, the point is clear enough. The one we call the acrotic or incontinent person seems wise but unable to act on his desire to do the wise thing, or the thing that wisdom chooses. He cannot determine which desire is to be motivationally decisive. Socrates accepts his questioner's incredulity, but rather than acknowledging the hypothesis that this person knows what to do and is thus Sophos, but not Encrates, that is, not Sophron, Socrates denies that he's even Sophos. He does so by redescribing the general situation. What everyone does is whatever he happens to think is best for himself. In the case his questioner has in mind, the person is not being blindsided, is not being overwhelmed by some unauthorized desire. The person who acts incorrectly is actually failing to know what is best for himself. He is not Sophos. He picks the wrong desire as the one to act from. So he is not Sophos, but why is he also not Sophron? After all, might it not have taken considerable strength of will for him to have executed his chosen, albeit stupid goal, to have defended himself against his desires to act otherwise? Neither Socrates nor Xenophon explain the reasoning here, but two answers suggest themselves. First, the Sophrosune of the putatively Sophron idiot would not be helpful for him. His tenacity in acting on his erroneous judgment would not be admirable. And yet virtues are admirable, laudable states of character. And so that tenacity should rather be called drivenness or stubbornness, something evaluatively neutral, even pejorative. This kind of argument is the sort used against Charmides in Plato's Charmides. Thus, the not Sophos man cannot be Sophron, which is good, by sticking to his self-undermining judgments, which sticking is bad. A second answer is more phenomenological than analytic, or a second explanation. The proposed person who fails to do what he knows he ought to do acts in a manner that does not reflect what we would expect to see from the exercise of Sophrosune. So, for example, this person's friend has suffered a tragedy, and he knows that he should call on his friend to offer support, but he does not do so. Evidently, his fear of misspeaking, his distaste for awkwardness, his worry that it will take too much of his time, outweigh for him the benefit, evident even to him, of simply reaching out. If he does not call on his friend, according to Socrates, he has miscalculated what the right thing to do is, so he is not Sophos. Yet, we also do not think that he's exhibiting Sophrosune in acting on his judgment that he should not call on his friend, because it does not feel or look like he is exhibiting this virtue. He does not seem to be bearing down and sticking to that judgment, staying away despite the siren song, the massive and insidious appeal of calling on his friend. In other words, he does not seem to be exercising any skillful filtering of desires, but instead simply to be going whither the strongest desires lead. Indeed, the very fact that he judged staying away as the best choice seems a result of his judgment of value, depending exactly on the strength of the impulse rather than on some better criteria. Thus, Socrates' view about Sophrosune makes some sense. It's an acknowledgement of what actually provides authoritative guidance in life, and this acknowledgement involves treating the desire to do it as decisive, despite there possibly being viscerally more urgent desires to do something else. So now the second of two Socratic cases, or quasi-verbatim cases, as I'm calling them. And this is in Memorabilia 4, where Xenophon describes, so to speak, this Socratic curriculum, where the education of Euthydemus provides his main example. In 4.2, Socrates has convinced Euthydemus to study with him, including to learn the practices that would be most kratista. But before making his students lecticos, practicos, and mechanicos, Xenophon repeats the 1.2, the Memorabilia 1.2 claim that Socrates started with Sophrosune. Otherwise, his students' powers could have been used unjustly and for doing devious things, kakurgen. So the lessons in Sophrosune start, Xenophon says, with Sophrosune concerning the gods peritheus. This is 4.3.1. As it turns out, Xenophon never in these chapters describes a Sophrosune concerning humans or of an unqualified sort. But since he thinks education in Sophrosune is at the bedrock of the Socratic project, he must think that this focus on Sophrosune concerning the gods somehow suffices. The conversation he reports Socrates having with Euthydemus is not, however, what one would expect to exemplify his teaching of this virtue, haplos. It's really an exemplary piece of natural theology. Since Euthydemus has not thought about the degree to which the gods are philanthropic, Socrates goes through the benefactions. Light, night, stars, moon, seasons, water, fire, sun, livestock, other beautiful and useful things, sense perception, reason, language, prophecy. He continues, such benefits are evidence not just of the gods' benevolence, but also of their existence. One can express one's gratitude by following the customs they enjoin. This then, so Socrates concludes, is the expression of Sophrosune, expecting the most to come from the gods and seeking to please them by obeying their laws. So Sophrosune seems then to involve first acknowledging the most decisive source of norms, those we're to take as authoritative, and second, following them. Oh, this is probably not really two steps, since acknowledgement of norms involves treating them as, in fact, action guiding. This view is, I think, consistent with the one I've reconstructed, in 394, though without the Sophia language. Presumably, Sophia would be responsible somehow for interpreting the commodious features of the world as signs of the gods' existence and benefactions. This view also seems consistent with the one in 1.2.14. Here, Socrates is upstanding kalokagathos, he's pious, and is spending time talking about excellence for humans. So, I imagine that Sophrosune peritheos stands in well for Sophrosune haplos, as we might say, for several reasons. The gods may be the highest source of norms, laws, regulations for human life. The obligations one has to them may be the most discreet and least optional. And Socrates' detractors may be best repelled by emphasizing his concern for the gods. So there may be some kind of apologetic reason it's sufficient. In a subsequent chapter, Socrates discusses justice as lawfulness, though he doesn't say it, just as eusebeia, effectively, is Sophrosune peritheos, perhaps dikaiosune is the Sophrosune peri anthropos. I mean, it's not a totally new thought, and it's suggested as well by Plato's Gorgias. Now, dikaiosune is equally concerned with obedience to laws, and it may take some wisdom to discern the laws, especially when they are unwritten or complex or indeterminate in their application. And it may also take wisdom to appreciate their sovereignty, even more than it does to appreciate the sovereignty of the gods. But even with the gods, like, well, some people think the gods are not really that concerned about the humans. Okay, so now I'm going to have a little conclusion here. So I'm sensitive to the confined scope and brevity of this presentation, which has been maybe more descriptive and reconstructive than it has been dialectical or problem-driven. So I should draw out at least what I take to be its stake, so we can also know what to talk about later on. So I said that to make progress on discovering views ascribable to the historical Socrates, we would need to know with considerable precision the structure of the views in fact attributed to him. Reading several passages in Xenophon's Memorabilia has been one part of that task. Doing so for other authors, then comparing, would have to follow. As it turns out, the views attributed to Socrates and Plato, for example, in the Gorgias and the Charmides and Republic, different in terms as each is, share remarkably much in deep structure with one another and with Xenophon's. They too get at agency as the capacity to act on those norms one acknowledges as authoritative, and Sophrosune as the virtue constitutive or the dispositional correlate of that agency. But as I hinted before, I'm diffident, and probably as diffident as any odd member in the audience, about ascribing any detailed views to the historical Socrates. I'm diffident as well about the value of being able to do so. So did Socrates think of Sophrosune as this virtue of agency, and is that one of his big insights? I mean, possibly, but more momentous, I think, is the intensity of conversation, debate, and reflection on the virtue during his mature years and in the subsequent decades. Xenophon, as companion of Socrates, but especially as synthesizer of other Socratic literature, and an ethical thinker in his own right, both reports on and advances that conversation. It is a conversation about what makes us selves, people distinctly responsible for what we do and see, being aspirationally unified by something other than our bodies and yet unavoidably embodied. For Xenophon and Plato, surely among other authors, writing about Socrates was useful for thinking through Sophrosune, which was useful for thinking through perhaps the human ideal. For us as philosophers, intellectual historians, students of ancient Greek culture, thinking about Socrates is also useful for thinking through Sophrosune, which for us may be among the leading Greek ideals. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's open things up to questions and comments. I invite you to raise your hands. Rusty Jones.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Rusty.
I have a very brief question about your reading of 394, in particular about the sort of minimalistic way you want to read the does not differentiate, the ou dioridze in the first line. And I wonder if reading that as something like coincides is viable in light of the first line of 395, where you have enai, you have dikaiasune, and all the rest of virtue is Sophia, it looks like. So I wonder if you could put those two passages next to one another and say how you think they fit.
Right, okay, so you're saying, well, in some respect, the question, much precision about the question of the relationship between Sophia and Sophrosune is made moot, because in the following paragraph, all of the virtues are just fully identified. And so we could just pull that back and say they are just the same. That's Rusty, what you're asking?
It's less a question about the unity of the virtues and whether they're identical to one another, and more a question of whether the vagueness in the expression does not differentiate, or something like that, at the beginning of 394, is resolved at the beginning of 395, when he seems to say that justice and just is. So, and it might be then tied with one another. It might be that each of the virtues is a different form of Sophia. I wasn't trying to add an issue, but just to say, maybe we get more determinate reading of the relation between Sophrosune and Sophia at the beginning of 395 than we do at the beginning of 394.
Yeah. Well, that seems reasonable, and I think my reasons, I suppose, for saying what I did about 394. Besides thinking that Xenophon is not really after precise distinctions between types of similarity, as we see in, by contrast to what we see in Socrates' question to Protagoras in the Protagoras, like what does it mean to speak of the virtues in relationship to one another, is syntax. So the primary reason besides that is something syntactical, and that is in the first sentence, I guess this first long sentence of 394, what looks a little like a strong parallel structure. And so I sort of have a sense that Xenophon is trying to map, the first terms, the terms with the participles to Sophia, and then the terms with the infinitives to Sophrosune. And that there's some kind of memorable antithetical gnomic quality to that observation. And I mean, also it's supposed to be a little bit paradoxical, I think. But I think that if Xenophon is going to be in a position to say what he says in the subsequent section, we might want to hold him responsible for that in the previous section.
Okay, Alex Lee.
Hi, thanks for that. So I have two related questions, or a two-part question. And so you started your paper by talking about how the term Sophrosune is ubiquitous in all of Xenophon's works. So I'm wondering if you think that he uses it in the same Socratic sense in all of the works. And the related question is that I think Helen North divides Sophrosune in two, basically, where she thinks that in the historical works, he uses it in like a prudential sense and a moral sense in the Socratic works. And I'm wondering if your reading can kind of collapse this distinction, if he does in fact use it in the same way throughout his corpus.
Yeah, those are great questions. I appreciate them. So the first one, so his use over the corpus, there we get a variety of uses that are consistent with this. They're not as theoretically precisified, but it's the same kind of variety of uses where some are concerned with we might think being reasonable, some are like not getting too antic. The same kind of variety that you would see in Isocrates, for example, an age mate. And in you might think, again, the somewhat not less theoretical uses of the term in Plato. So I take the remarks about Socrates' perspective as consistent with, but yes, obviously rather more freighted with detail and unified. But this is connected to the second point. I suppose I have some strong disagreement with North and then Rademacher, who's doing even more, out-northing North in finding distinctions between uses, because I just don't think it's sort of linguistically plausible, but also I think because, as you imagine, the Charmides is a good case where you can have the same virtue and you can talk about in epistemic terms, knowledge of knowledge, knowing oneself, knowing what's good, and so forth. And you can talk about it in behavioral or dispositional context, walking gently or gently walk, I don't know, walking calmly, tranquilly, quietly. And that fact that using two languages and seemingly two departments of life, the mind and the body, doesn't mean that there's one Sophrosune for one and one Sophrosune for the other. Rather, it's an extremely interesting question how it could be that knowing oneself conduces to tranquility or to a sense of modesty or whatever, but it's not impossible to see how it could happen. And it seems much of the depiction of Socrates, especially the relationship between talking about virtues and being virtues, is an attempt to try to get at that. And I mean, one could try to preserve the Northian appearances and say, well, they're, early on in Homer, there was a single use, and then, the intellectual use, and then it divided, and then Plato's or the Socratic's job was to pull it back together. But that it would be really special pleading. And in any event, the cases in the Republic, Homer, same thing. But the cases in Homer can be described equally well as, use of Sophrosune as intellectual virtue, that is like, what the relevant considerations for acting when you're confronting venerable personages, and therefore it's intellectual virtue of prudence, as well as how not to just like splurt out any old thing. So it's also a dispositional virtue. And so I think that Xenophon, not that he's aware of that, but there's no reason to see in his work evidence for a split between these two, even if, as we're saying with Homer, you could gloss a number of cases of Sophrone or Sophron in the Cyropedia as seemingly more dispositional.
Thank you.
Carol Attack.
Hi, thank you for that. It's really interesting and very helpful for me to have Xenophon be in the center of the picture. You mentioned the relationship between Encourager and Sephiroth at one point, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that. And I'm wondering whether there's some kind of matrix in operation that might link into the distinctions that Alex was pointing towards in his question just now. I mean, I guess 4-5 is the key dialogue for this, but I mean, is Encourager a kind of starter version of Sophrosune? Do you have to do it first, or quite how do they fit together, given that Encourager is so very central to Xenophon, perhaps even more than it is to Socrates?
Yeah, so maybe I can say something fairly schematic about that. So, so here's the first sort of literary formal response, and that is the sheer fact that Book 4 by Xenophon is being presented as a curriculum. It's not. Yeah. He's more or less saying you do this in order, or you could interpret it that way, and that Sophrosune is the first step, or whatever, step 2, I don't know. And then Enkrateia is a step down the road, suggests to me first that they are separate, and second that Enkrateia is not necessary for understanding Sophrosune, or for Sophrosune in some way. Here's so it's quite schematic, loose, possible explanation. Because we don't need to say that they are obviously, evidently totally separate, but what if Enkrateia is the capacity to tamp down certain visceral desires? And so you think, what is the courageous person doing? Well, in one respect, understanding what's valuable and relative relation between one's being and the city's being, blah, blah, blah. But what the courageous person is also doing is not letting the fear that's just like moving through their limbs from causing them to run away. And my sense is that Xenophon wants to focalize or spotlight that aspect, that inner force, what really does feel like and that's the Enkrateia. And the Sophrosune is more on in some sense on the normative side, that it is the acknowledgement, the judgment, and so forth. And now these are going to have to work together, because it's going to be quite difficult to acknowledge norms if you are being bowled over by feelings of fear. But we can at least see them as conceptually different. And I think the same will hold for, maybe this is a kind of response to, as a response to Rusty, it's a acceptance like, well, whatever the relationship between Sophrosune and Sophia happen to be, whether identical or not identical, at least the Sophia stuff is highlighting some sort of, whatever it means to judge something as valuable or not. And the Sophrosune is whatever it is to say, oh, this applies to me, I must do some things following.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's helpful, but I think there is I think you're right. It is a matrix, and I think that there's both Xenophon and the Socrates matrix axis.
Yeah, and again, one can say, well, what are the cases where it's more useful to talk about one thing rather than another? I mean, as we see in Republic 4, when Socrates is glossing Sophrosune, and sometimes it's what it's being measured. Maybe it's krate and hiautu. Maybe it's, some people say basically, oh, it's being in control of your desires. So, I mean, control over one's desires is a thing you can say, and it totally makes sense with respect to Sophrosune. I think the Socratic normative perspective of virtue, though, not really Humean, but it's like, okay, there's control over the desires. That's a kind of capacity, a kind of ability, like to lift heavy stuff. Is that going to be a virtue in the Socratic sense? Well, maybe not, because you could be controlling the wrong desires. You could be badly ascetic. You could be controlling the, it's like they say, like, oh, I had this desire to exercise, so I sat down and waited 10 minutes until the desire went away. Or, similarly, like I started wanting to think about philosophy, but I was able to tamp it down and just go on watching television undistractedly. So perhaps enkrateia is not aimed toward what's best or what's authoritative in the same way that Sophrosune is, but that doesn't mean it's not really essential. And it could be that Xenophon's view is that, sure, there's people who know what the right thing is, but if they are not really able to manage that inner turmoil, then they're not as admirable as they could be.
Okay, before I call on the next person, let me make a kind of suggestion, I guess. There's a tendency, if you're in a group of 50 to 60 people, to be reticent and think, well, I'm going to let some of these many other people have the floor rather than put myself forward. I encourage you not to be shy in that way, because if everybody thinks that, then there are good questions that don't get asked. So don't be shy about putting your hand up. Katerina Lefka.
Hello to all. Am I heard?
Yes, fine.
Thank you very much for this very interesting speech. I also salute the idea that to have a more clear vision about Socrates, it is very interesting to have that parallel examination between Plato's and Xenophon's testimonia. And I really way to treat the subject. There are two things I would like to say. First, we know also when we track the notions in ancient Greek and their meaning, especially virtues, that they are very fluid, in fact. Only one way of understanding a term. We can see it already in one other, but if we go along the whole philosophical or other literature of antiquity, we can see very well that it is not only in one way that we can understand and translate in our different languages that same ancient term. And So indeed, it is very difficult to put limits in a way that is so clear. We don't have one-to-one relation between the word and the meanings, which is the case, of course, with Sophrosune here, as you very well pointed out. And I just wanted to say that it shouldn't be a surprise. And perhaps that idea of relationship between Sophia and Sophrosine, in Socrates especially, vision, could be highlighted, and I would like your opinion on this, by the way we have Socrates' attitude towards ethics. We know that his whole dialectics is a theoretical and very strict analysis, logical analysis of all the terms, of all the notions and their consequences and their reasons. And at the same time, for him, this is the only way for someone to become a good person and to apply it. And so for him, theory and practice are so linked that we know all very well his motto that nobody can be bad because he's willing to be bad. No, it's only ignorance that make people do bad actions and become bad persons. So his theoretical analysis of a notion is at the same time for him the royal way to arrive to the right action and to the goodness and the colloquia. So is it perhaps in this way that we should see that very, very close relationship between being a wise person, a sophos, and a sophron, a temperament, or a person who knows what to do at the right moment and he does it as he thinks that he should? Thank you.
Well, this brings up something quite fascinating about, as someone's, as one would say, like Plato Socrates versus Xenophon Socrates, and or even the vision of Sophrosune in the Charmides and something like it in the Republic. And that is, well, is it possible for Socrates to be sophron and not be wise in the really robust sense that he says he is not wise? You could ask that. You could ask that about the guardians and the Republic, the philosopher rulers. That is, are they going to be sophron or sophroness only because they are sophoi? And one gets a sense that from the Platonic Socrates' perspective, it would be nice if there was some space for the answer being no, that you didn't have to be fully wise, sophos, in the kind of divine sense to be sophron. But you have to be sophos, and so at least in some other way. And so then maybe it's not actually a disagreement about the thesis, it's a disagreement about what makes the thesis true and what exactly is the reference of our various terms. And so, for example, like how could Socrates say, like, I don't know all these things, but I just want to know? How could he then be sophron if those are, if his not knowing seems to be obstacle to his Sophrosune? What are the things that he does know? Well, he recognizes his lack of knowledge, and therefore he realizes that he needs to pursue it, and he's going to pursue it in such and such a way, which includes not being distracted by food or drink, but sticking to the argument, whither it goes, trying to cultivate the relationships that are most intellectually fecund, and so on and so forth. So I think that the question, can Socrates, or rather, does Socrates believe that Sophia and Sophrosune are coinciding, or identical, is a kind of question that, to answer it, gets us to very deep questions about what it is to have this kind of Socratic epistemological humility and ethical optimism of some sort. And in the passage 394 and the passage 4.3, I don't get the sense that Xenophon is there trying to deal with those questions. It's like, well, if you know if you know the direction to look for doing good stuff, you look there, and then you do the good stuff. Maybe that is enough. But in any event, I think that the exciting questions for me are in trying to understand how you can just get out of saying like, well, it's possibly good as long as you're just omniscient and omnipotent, because that doesn't seem what Socrates or Plato's depicting Socrates as believing.
All right, I'll make just a prefatory comment. We're honored and grateful to our Japanese and Chinese colleagues for zooming in at such an inconvenient hour. And Professor Wei, you have a question?
Yeah, that's right. Hi, Christopher.
And thank you.
Yeah, well, actually, my first question was about Encourager, and someone already asked. I think the second question is about Sophrosune and justice. I agree that book 4 of the memorabilia is very schematic, is a systematic curriculum, but it's curious that Sophrosune comes before the discussion of justice. But if Sophrosune is about acknowledging authoritative norms and as action guiding, but I think justice at least has the same role to play here. Yeah, could you say more about that? Thanks.
Yes, well, so my hypothesis was that justice is Sophrosune peri anthropos. I mean, sorry to say, I don't know why I decided to say that in such a sententious way, but I think that that's also true. I mean, again, maybe I'm like a little bit hung up on the Socrates, I mentioned before, Socrates' non-conversation with Callicles in the Gorgias. But at least it's like a going idea in the air that, well, you have Sophrosune. The part with respect to humans is justice. The part with respect to the gods is piety or reverence or whatever. And actually, the sort of encratic part, he says in the Gorgias, is the, the part where you're like trying to keep, strong against your desires is courage. So there in the Gorgias, Sophrosune is the whole thing. Now, how much sense can we make of that in the Xenophontic context? I'm not sure, because it's not as though Xenophon pulls out piety from Sophrosune and then pulls out justice. It seems unbalanced, but I think it could be sort of implicit. And I mean, just to come back to the Gorgias case, and again, apologies to those who think that talking about Plato is just totally contaminated and it's just totally irrelevant, but mostly Socrates has been talking about Sophrosune. And then near the end of the argument, it's like, yeah, so in Sophrosune and Dikaiosune, these are really valuable for living well, or rather necessary for eudaimonia and blessedness. And so there's a kind of insouciance, almost, a kind of ease of moving between Sophrosune and Sophrosune kai Dikaiosune. You see something similar again in the Platonic source, but at the end of Protagoras' great speech in the Protagoras, where again, Dikaiosune and Sophrosune are not distinguished. They are paired, and they might be paired emphatically. I mean, they could be exclusive binaries, but there's no reason to believe that must be the case. Just like that somehow they are similar enough to be worth speaking of together. And now my sort of just like moral linguistics intuitions, totally untutored intuitions, are that both, maybe in different contexts, are, by the end of the 5th century, the strong language for, what we'd call moral virtue, whatever that means. And so sometimes Sophrosune will be the sort of the salient term. Sometimes Dikaiosune will be. There's no, as it were, reason. There's no reason to believe that they must have their own independent domains. There's no reason at all that they need to have their independent domains. I mean, Aristotle thinks that all virtues have their independent domains. Mm-hmm. In the Republic, in book 4, we see like this is a kind of strange thing to try to do, and we could try to give independent domains to the virtues. It's going to take a lot of wiggling around. But in general, you might think terms are relevant in one place, they're salient in another place. We might wonder philosophically, how do they differ? So, I mean, this can seem like a non-answer, except that for Xenophon, I think it's not so much of a non-answer, because though he is at times interested in these theoretical elaborations of terms, the distinctions are at a kind of global level, I just don't think are going to seem to have a kind of fidelity to reality.
Okay. Well, may I have a very quick follow-up? Well, but if we don't really distinguish their different domains, then can we still discuss the fundamentality of Sophrosune? Or we just talk about the unity of virtues? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, not if one says Sophrosune is fundamental and justice must be derivative or instrumental or epiphenomenal or whatever. So no, of course. I mean, to call a virtue fundamental is a dumb thing to do, except to seem like one's making a grand claim. So ISSS people come to go talk. So as you will perhaps note, I did not give any arguments for the fundamentality of Sophrosune. I mean, I don't mean to be picking on you about that, because obviously I did say that I think that that would be theoretically problematic and would require a view of virtue that I can't accept, and I don't think that Socrates or Xenophon could accept, namely that virtues have their own domains, and that it is really the case that somehow some virtues could be subsidiary to others, or that in some kind of temporal or logical way one must, what the full or the partial adoption of one virtue must precede another one. I suppose we might think of it rather in terms of connectivity, or or like what seems to be the most important elements when we're thinking about a virtue. Well, when we're thinking about a virtue, we're thinking of sensitivity to norm. So we can have a contrast, sorry for going on, but this is helpful because it clarifies maybe the enkrateia versus Sophrosune idea that I was saying with Carol. Namely, if you want to say, well, enkrateia, that's the fundamental virtue. So, well, what you're saying is the most important thing about the most fundamental thing, or the most important thing about virtue is that you are in control of your desires.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, from the Socratic perspective, I don't think that's true, because I think from the Socratic perspective, knowledge is so important. Why? Well, because I think he thinks that we don't just start out knowing like which desires to control and how much and when. What's really important is knowing what the right thing to do is, or knowing what's true, or knowing what's good. Now, there will then be a kind of hoplos of, that is, the kind of material that will allow one to orient yourself and get there. And so I think that's what I mean by fundamentality. And that's why when I keep saying sort of ad nauseum, oh, it's acknowledgement, like that word can just seem stupid, or a trick. And it's a trick because, it seems both practical and cognitive. And that's what I want to capture. I think Sophrosune is capturing that.
Okay, Jessica Decker.
Hi, thank you, Christopher. That was excellent. As you might remember last summer, I was talking to you in Sicily about how much I find Socrates' ethics to be really similar to what I find in Heraclitus. So I'm writing a book on Heraclitus right now. So I'm going to very selfishly ask you about what you think about what's going on in Socrates with Sophrosune. I'm going to type this into the chat so that you can see the Greek. I'm talking about Heraclitus DK 112. So the question I want to ask, what you find in Socrates, first of all, what Sophrosune has to do with self-knowledge. You've already said a little bit about that. But what I want to know, what do you think the relationship is between Sophrosune and aletheia, particularly because we get, this is DK 112, but DK 116 is the one where Heraclitus sort of seems to parrot the oracle with the sort of know thyself, is another place we get the Sophrosune. And what I find interesting about DK 112 is that Heraclitus is pairing speak and action. So to be able to speak and to do katafusin, but it's the only occurrence of aletheia in Heraclitus. So I wonder, because I see so much going on in Socrates that seems to be very similar to the ethical position that I see going on in Heraclitus. So I wonder if you see similar connections between self-knowledge and aletheia happening in Socrates with Sophrosune as we might see going on in Heraclitus. Thank you very much, and sorry for asking such a selfish question.
No. I mean, that's not selfish because you're trying to. I mean, unless you think getting self-knowledge is selfish.
Yeah.
but it's a good that benefits all of us, or practically all of us. So no, those cases are great, and I mean, obviously the connection between Socrates and those passages in Heraclitus is so strong that for 200 years those passages have been athetized as late paraphrases because they think because scholars think they've been contaminated by late 5th century theorizing, namely Socratic theorizing, which doesn't follow. So I whatever, to the extent that I have any view about things, I accept them. Now, this isn't what you're asking, but yes, obviously Sophrosune and self-knowledge, we have the Charmides, for example. And indeed, there are aspects of even the Republic account of Sophrosune in Book 4 has each part recognizes which part is in charge and decides to let that part be in charge, that ought to be in charge. I mean, that itself you could be thinking of as a kind of self-knowledge. You recognize which position you're in with respect to ruling. Okay, so self-knowledge and Sophrosune seems pretty clearly in the air. Now, about aletheia. I mean, this is really good because this, I think, is getting the norm governedness in play. So what we could say about Sophrosune, and I'm presenting as a kind of descriptive, mechanistic kind of Sophrosune, the encratic, the non-norm governed kind. It's just like having the power to tamp down whatever desires you're tamping down. One could have a similar view about Sophrosune. I'm sorry, about self-knowledge. It's like, oh, it's just like looking to see what's in there. And well, I know myself perfectly because I know there's a lot of crap in there. And you think like, well, so what's good about that? Well, I mean, you could say, well, because it's preparatory for other stuff. And that's fine, in the same way that enkrateia could be preparatory for other stuff. But is that really the only way to think about things? And you're pointing out that Heraclitus is saying, no, it's not the only way to be thinking about things. We could be seeing that there's more content in self-knowledge, that in some sense it's normative, that it could be a matter of trying to understand what you're committed to, like what you take to be true. And how do you know like what you take to be true? You have to like think about it. This is kind of this idea, this kind of transparency view. You don't just like introspect to discover your belief. You engage in investigation, you engage in conversation, you engage in argument so you can figure out what you actually believe. The things you happen to have opinions about or that you have some whimsical thought, do you even say you know that or you believe it? Not really. I mean, you can report it, but you wouldn't probably stand by it so much. So I think that what you're saying is that Heraclitus, in both, it is a property of all humans to know themselves and Sophrone, and also the greatest virtue is Sophrosune and Sophia, blah, 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 blah. In both cases, although the case where we actually have aletheia at play, it's clearer that it is that self-knowledge is somehow continuous with acknowledging what is actually most valuable, what is objectively, truly most valuable. And at Heraclitus, you might think, oh, we can understand that because it's the logos, or it's ta sophon, or the cosmos, or whatever. But I think that both of them are trying to get away from the sense that, or maybe get away, whatever, not have the sense that, well, Sophrosune and self-knowledge, those are the inner, the inner virtue and the inner cognitive state versus justice and Sophia, which are outward. As are the inner, because the inner is just messy and dark and all that. But instead saying that's another way of talking about figuring out what our principles are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Especially DK1, Heraclitus says, those they're like the untried or untested, and I think that's really good for thinking about Socratic like Elenchus. And yeah, thank you. That's a really great answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.
Nick Smith.
So, yeah, thanks. I wanted to just ask, this is somewhat riding my own hobby horse, but I wonder if you were worried, I think in your answer to Katerina, you were worried a little bit about there being a problem with sort of being sophron, which looks like something that we want to be able to say people can be and Socrates can be, but it looks like the connection between that and being sophos gets problematized with the profession of ignorance. I wonder if it might not help with that particular problem. If instead of thinking about being sophos as sort of being in possession of certain sort of very special information, if we don't take the craft analogy a bit more seriously. And the feature of that that I think would be helpful is that obviously crafts are mastered sort of in degrees and in different measures. Sorry, I'm having a right. So and both Plato and Xenophon characterize Socrates as the wisest of men, not necessarily for the same reasons, but they both take the oracle to sort of show that. Now that's a comparison not to the god, but to other men. And I guess what I'm wondering is if we take Sophia to be craft or craft-like, and we take Sophrosune to be craft or craft-like, it's entirely possible for Socrates or for someone to be some of each of them, and perhaps even some of each of them to the same or some sort of connected degree, and then also to regard Socrates as kind of the guy with the most.
Yeah. So I accept that. I mean, I have no reason not to, and I have positive reason to believe it since it's a reasonable view. And I mean, it's probably true. It's a matter of actual life. And so I didn't take that to be part of the argument. I still think that it is an interesting kind of comparison case between Plato and Xenophon in the way that they are describing Socrates' attitude toward the possession of Sophia, especially given the sort of the fireworks around claims to being sophos or not. So, but that you might think of as a literary apologetic thing. Now, when it comes to the Charmides, I think there the issue, or especially comparing the Charmides picture and the Republic picture, some of those issues get drawn out more sharply, such that, I mean, it's not the case that both might not be resolvable to the issue of crafts and incremental increases in ability or competence, expertise. But by focusing on these incremental increases in competence or relative competence, we turn our eyes a little bit from the centrality, dialectical centrality of the professions of ignorance. So one might say, so we can accept sort of the factuality that Socrates might in fact be quite sophos or sophoteros or sophotatos relative to the other people or other citizens or what have you. And yet we still want to understand what argumentative role his professions of ignorance play in his analysis, for example, of Sophrosune, or the conversation about Sophrosune. We see this in the Charmides much more than we see it in Xenophon or the Republic, or perhaps even in the Gorgias. And I think one thing I would point to there, now again, this is now just sort of digressing from the details every point, except to say, like, why is it even worth talking about this if we can just appeal to the craft analogy as a resolution? And that is, you might think that seeking out the elimination of one's conceits of knowledge may have either a protreptic or actually investigatively valuable effect. It might key you into dealing with different controversy in a different way. It might get you to be returning over and over to certain kinds of assumptions. It might key you into the source of problems, like it's not just a problem in inference or a problem of disagreement, but actually a lack of full understanding. And further, there might even be some sort of practical, you might think of the practice of conversation results. So for example, about the way you should ask questions or listen to answers or whatever it happens to be. And to the extent that Socrates might seem an especially Sophrone conversationalist, Sophrone interlocutor, might think, oh, that is being thematized, that's being focalized in connection to this business about his being Sophrone because he doesn't believe that he knows what he doesn't know.
Okay, Mariana Koshkarian.
To ask two very short questions. I don't know how relevant they are to the questions discussed today, but one of them, no, first the expression, the historical Socrates. Do you mean by historical Socrates non-Plato's character, simply, since we have not enough sources to speak about historical Socrates, only except if we take for granted that Xenophon described everything as it was. So I'm not sure that everybody would agree with this. And the second question is, you started with the distinction, very important, between Aristotelian and Platonic systems of virtues. But there are some places in Plato, first which came to my mind now, is the end of the Republic. For example, that we have always to choose the middle way in this life. It sounds alien to Plato. It could be attributed to Aristotle, but it goes against the views exposed by Plato in this book itself. So how can you explain the presence of such ideas and more concretely, more precisely of this idea that we should always choose the middle way in Plato's work? Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. So so with respect to the first question, the historical Socrates, well, I'll try to answer this with two pieces. So the first, certainly, I wouldn't think that Xenophon's Socrates is somehow supposed to be, or we could take it to be, take that image to be somehow more transparent to the reality. I mean, it's, in the first place, maybe the memorabilia is being written in the 360s or something like that. In the second place, he's reading lots of other literature, a lot of other Socratic literature. And now, all historians of philosophy who are writing about historical characters are, well, they ought to be reading other secondary literature. And so they should be in kind of conversation. They shouldn't just be like, well, my view of Kant is like directly connected, you know. So, so to be sure, I am not thinking that Xenophon is better evidence or something like that. And indeed, I'm not, as you know, I'm not even saying that, well, if we find where Xenophon and Plato are the same, then we know what we're talking about. Because that doesn't make sense, given that Xenophon is intermediated and Plato could well be intermediated and so forth. But I won't rehearse that argument. But yes, I did mean that, I mean that dialectically, I did mean the historical Socrates, because the historical Socrates is in fact an agent in the intellectual culture of the late 5th century, or the even, well, who knows for how much of the 5th century, a lot of it. It would be absurd to think that all the other named figures did stuff, but he didn't. And then all that there is the uptake whenever the uptake happened. After his death, for example, though not necessarily, because we know, I mean, there's plenty of evidence from 430s and 420s from old comedy. So, I mean, the point is to say, well, or what the point with respect to the Socratic problem is to say, well, since this is a real person, as Thucydides and Euripides and so forth are real people who had influences and were influenced by the intellectual culture, can we say anything special about him? And of course, we can say a lot of stuff, sort of, about his influence on those who were writing, Plato and Xenophon, not very clearly, but we can say stuff. This was the background of that point. Now, with respect to the end of Plato's Republic, I don't have something specific to say. And I mean, it's clear, I think to me, and probably to anybody, that if you read Aristotle on Sophrosune in the Ethics 3:10 through 12, Justin and Nick McCain, with similar accounts elsewhere, this account is quite different from the account given anywhere else in Plato. Even if there's some superficial similarities, there is no full similarity. And so it strikes me, at least on that question, not with respect to overall theory of virtue, that Plato and Aristotle were doing different things with respect to virtue. They had different reasons to set virtue out, both individually and as a mass, to set them out as they did. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they had a bazillion conversations, or 10 conversations, or 3 conversations about virtue, but I don't think that they met in the middle, as it were, about that.
Thank you.
I think now, toward the end here, I'll permit myself to ask a question, Christopher, and that is about the political angle. It's a reasonable speculation, I wonder what you think about this, that hiding behind or lying evidently behind the discussion of Sophrosune is the case of Alcibiades. It seems like that's a virtue that he very conspicuously lacked, and the Athenians blamed Socrates for, some of them did, blamed Socrates for Alcibiades, and the lack of Sophrosune that Alcibiades demonstrated as a young man, as a general, and a traitor, and so on and so forth, make that an important virtue. And one speculation for why it comes first in that list in book 4 is the political apologetic reason that if you're going to allay the suspicions of the Athenians, you've got to show that Socrates sees to that one first. So I just want to ask you about the political angle of Sophrosune.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I mean, it seems, I'm not saying like, well, it's obvious, but I mean, it is the case that in 1:2, Xenophon is responding to the potential view that Socrates gave his associates power without, I mean, he doesn't use this language, but without the ability to wield it correctly. And so, you know, and with the premise that they were with him only for a short time, or anyway, a limited period of time, he can't even say like, okay, I gave them the power, and then I gave them the ability to use it correctly, is to go in the other direction. And now, so that could be an apologetic, there could be apologetic reasons for putting things that way. I guess to say that, though, is to wonder, well, might, apologetics aside, might there have been a reason to do things in a different order? Like not to have taught Sophrosune first, but to have taught the capacity to speak well, or something like that, dialectike first, or enkrateia, or something like that And I suppose so, although that, of course, is now overly, over-interpreting Xenophon's curricular idea, like that you could somehow conceivably actually teach Sophrosune first and then the other things, especially when I take it literally that Xenophon is saying in 1-2 that Socrates taught Sophrosune by being kalos kagathos and by talking about virtue, haplos, or generally, or something like that. And so I think that rather it's like what, here the apologetics become easy when you say, like, here's the phenomenon. Socrates is having these conversations of such and such a sort. We can focus on something that is obviously intended to happen from these kinds of conversations, namely education in Sophrosune. Now, we could have picked out that these conversations are also really good at teaching people how to have a conversation, how to dialegistai. You might also think they're quite good at teaching dikaiosune, because you have to take turns, you have to listen, you have to do these other things. And so from the one quite nice practical event of the colloquium or the conversation, you can pull out all these things that are happening and say they're effectively happening simultaneously. So I would say that.
All right, well, let's thank our speaker for coming to us virtually and reaching all corners of or many corners of the globe. The next colloquium will be 2 weeks hence, Gabriel Danzig on Plato's Symposium. Hope to see you there.
You will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. That was really good.
Thank you very much.
I'm quite
Thanks.
glad. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.